This is the Content Strategy Insights podcast, episode number 203. 10 years ago, web development was in a very different place. New technologies like cloud computing, APIs, Git repos, static site generators, and headless CMSs were emerging, but how they might all work together wasn't yet clear. Into this primordial version of the modern web stepped Chris Bach. Chris co-founded Netlify, an innovative development platform which has been instrumental in creating the web's new decoupled and composable architectures.
Welcome to the Content Strategy Insights podcast, where accomplished content strategy experts share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. Our mission is to democratize content strategy, to make its principles and practices accessible to everyone. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 203 of the Content Strategy Insights podcast. I am really excited today to welcome to the show Chris Bach. Chris is the co-founder at Netlify, a web services company that it's a development platform where probably most of the stuff you look at on the web is happening over there. He's also an advisor to a lot of other companies, an investor. He sits on a number of executive on a number of boards. So welcome, Chris. Tell the folks a little bit more about what you're up to these days.
Thanks for having me. Yes, I co-founder of Netlify, as you said, a developer platform. We run a lot of sites, stores, applications, and so on. For the last 3.5 years, I've been CSO there, so a little less operational. And then I actually just stepped out of my full-time role there. So now still sit on the board, but focus on continue my work as an advisor, as an investor, and as a board member. Also looking at a little bit of climate tech, which is a little outside the scope of today's conversation.
I'd love to talk more about that some other time. But the first thing, I think a lot of folks like Netlify in the landscape that many of my listeners occupy, it's a thing they're probably, their content is going through every day, but they probably don't know what it is. Can you describe the company and maybe the origins of it too? Because it was a new concept when you started it.
Yes.
10 years ago. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, so the origin is, and the backstory of this was that the web 10 years ago was struggling, and it was losing out to walled gardens like app stores and so on. And it wasn't because you were using one, a piece of software, let's say WordPress or Drupal or whatever. It didn't really matter. It had to do with the architecture underneath it. And that architecture meant that a website essentially was a program running on a singular server somewhere and building a version of itself for every single visitor. And that made it fairly slow. It also made it very vulnerable. The code was exposed, and it didn't scale very well. And my co-founder and I were sort of eager to see what could be done to change this, right? Because the web is a place where everyone has permission to publish and so on, right? Like it should be a place where if you want to publish something, you shouldn't have all these gatekeepers, and it shouldn't be sort of controlled by a singular company. And what we saw was that if you could do essentially what happened with mobile apps, which is decoupling the application itself from the backend, that would solve all the major issues. Right. So the notion is that you can more pre-build the front end, and that front end means your UI, your presentation there, whatever someone is going to experience on that browser, however they're visiting that. If that can be separated from the backend that has to run and feed all the data into it, well, then that can be pre-built to a higher degree. It also solves for if you have multiple digital touch points. Let's say I have a mobile web application, I have, campaign sites, I have my main.com and so on. All of those can draw from the same backend because they're sort of built separately. And then they would just access the backend. That's what we today would typically talk about as like a headless API, a microservice and so on, right? And this decouplement just made a lot of sense, right? So essentially, we wanted to decouple the front end from the back end. And in that, we saw that it would solve for notions of scalability. You would have multiple points of origin. It would be way faster, more secure, more scalable. But it would, at the same time, also require a reinvention of the ecosystem. So let's take e-commerce, right? So every e-commerce provider at that point, well, their output was always a website, right? It was a .com or whatever it might be. And so that means that you can have that, right? And then that outputs your website, and that's it. And so you can't marry that with something else that also has an output of a website. In other words, we needed someone to sort of come and invent some headless commerce solutions and headless content management solutions, and so on and so forth. Everything from form handling, which it was one of our first ideas because it was so frequently asked for, right? Like sign up for newsletters or whatever it might be, because this started with blogs right in the beginning. But this was really the notion. There were a few things already that we had made as like third-party services. So if you think of payment gateways, right, that was a typical thing. I don't build that myself. We figured that out even before then. But we still ran these monoliths. And so we said, okay, well, we can't build out an ecosystem, but we can sort of pave the way of saying, when you go, what we today talk about as composable, headless, when you follow the sort of best practice of the Jamstack, you know, in Danish, where I'm originally from, Denmark, you say, dear child has many names. And there's a lot of ways of talking about it, a lot of nomenclature out there. But essentially, if you follow this architecture, then when you get, let's say, a traditional CMS, what you're also getting is not just content management, you're also getting a template engine, a build tool, glue code. You're getting all these things that you don't really think about, but it's there to help you sort of output a site at the end of the day. Now those things had to be sort of more, I can mix and match the best builder and the best tool over here and the best commerce solution, the best CMS, but how do they actually talk together? How do they integrate? How's that, notion integrated with things like CDCI, like that's continuous integration and deployment, and how is it actually distributed/hosted afterwards, right? And so, in other words, you needed to rethink the whole workflow, the whole orchestration and operation parts of how we do these site stores and apps. And that was a platform that we felt that we can go and build. And so that's what we did. That's the origin, right? We built out Netlify as a workflow platform for anyone that wanted to build these decoupled sites. But of course, back then, there wasn't really a notion of decoupled and what it actually entailed. So we came up with the terminology around Jam.
Yeah, and talk about Jam, because it's well, actually, I'll let you define it, because I've heard the M described as a couple of different things, but you invented this, so I'm going to defer to your origin story knowledge of it.
Well, this is JavaScript's API as a markup, right? Like it was the notion of decoupling, but there were a lot of things that led to this decoupling, like that enabled it, right? Chief amongst this was actually that browsers had become an operating system, because that's why you had an app store, right? On mobile phones. Many people don't know that when Steve Jobs presented the iPhone in a PDF, the App Store didn't exist. All those icons were showcased to websites. It was only because, again, the web wasn't in an architectural state that was performant enough that we shifted and said, well, this is not going to work, right? Can't pull in the UI every time you turn a page. The phones aren't fast enough. The broadband isn't fast enough. Like, we have to do something else. Why don't we pre-build this, download it, execute it by the phone's operating system, and then pull in whatever needs that real-time updating from other microservices? Great, problem solved. Hey, by the way, now we can get an app store and we can take 30%, then we can regulate all this, right? But I think the browser had become a full-fledged operating system. That used to be a document viewer, right? Like that became like sort of a really linchpin in this. Hey, you can actually take that runtime, and instead of having one server that have to cater 100 visitors, you can have 100 browsers doing that for you. Then, of course, came much more powerful edge software. There was also distribution and compute, and like that has all evolved since then, right? But the best practices evolved. There's still the basic notion of decoupling those things has existed and has become obviously quite default today. But in this, we sort of had to talk about another part of this was using Get, right? Another part of this was using like early site generators and what we talk about as JavaScript frameworks, and so there were early stabs at all these things, but there weren't, and some, as I said, very mature, like, browsers, but there weren't a notion by anyone that they were all part of this same story, that this actually enabled a new architecture altogether. And so in order for that to become a thing and to become a movement, and for the ecosystem that we were super dependent on to start building for this, it had to be to build for something, right? Otherwise, it's just, well, Git is great, like it's version control. That's end
No,
of
I gotta
story.
say,
Like,
for
no,
those of us on the outside looking back, it's like that story checks out. But you were there building this thing. So because
yeah,
so you've mentioned like a lot of the things that were there, like cloud computing, this notion of, and the closely associated, I guess, notion of APIs. Like you have the ability to do stuff
yeah,
abstractly and scalably in the
yeah,
cloud. You have APIs as the way to stitch it together. Then you have I'd forgotten the detail of the browser capabilities being so crucial. And
yeah,
then the idea of having Git there as a place to put all your code. That's really
exactly.
how I can't remember, like, how did those all kind of like tumble together at the nearly in the
Well,
same
it's more
era?
sort of saying,
Yeah.
hey, if we decouple this, what are the dependencies? What would it take to work? And you sort of identify, well, the API economy is becoming a thing, right? But it's a thing. It's not because you're saying, hey, I have to make this available as an API because then it can service these decoupled websites, right? It's not that understanding. So you're not specifically building toward it, and it needed even more momentum, right? And so that was the notion of saying, hey, if we right now we just draw some lines in the sand and saying, if these things happen, if we circle around this and we keep building out here, then this version of the web essentially will be viable, right? So we need to take that and get everyone else excited about it as well, right? And so Jamstack, JavaScript API markup had nothing to do with like Netlify, very often, like if you look at the mean stack or lamb stack and so on, right? The acronyms has to do with like specific service providers. But we're two Danish guys, right? Like we weren't sort of thinking that would be a wise move. And again, like, I was much more interested in getting an ecosystem in, growing the pie, so to speak, right? And so we wanted to talk about it in a way that everyone, including competitors or anyone with competitive overlap, would also want to embrace it, right? And so that was the notion of the Jamstack. And the idea was that, hey, like if you use this approach, you get these sites that address the main issues with web essentially today, like web properties today, right? Whether it's sites, stores, and apps. And that was the notion behind Jamstack, right? And the basic was that, hey, you want to not run thing as a monolith on a singular server. You want to distribute the workload by decoupling. And then the best practices, they changed, right? Like, of course, you needed to rethink distribution. So distribution back then was typically a content delivery network, or a CDN. However, that CDN was like, Cloudflare and so on, was meant for images and video files. It was never really meant to do anything else but that. What we needed was something that was geared for small files, right? Like you needed to actually take the whole site, the HTML itself, and distribute it. The site or the property had to have multiple points of origin, and then nothing was built for this. So we had to build our own. As part of the solution. So even though we always saw ourselves as a workflow company, we had to be able to provide that infrastructure. Now, we didn't have our own metal. We just piggybacked off the data centers and we still do, like the large cloud providers out there, which also gives a lot of flexibility and a lot of redundancy and all these things that you typically want laid on as an enterprise. But that's another story. Mm-hmm. But that was really it, right? Like, so some of the things we had to invent and others were already there, but they weren't thought in connection as in to support this new way of building. And that was really the motivation behind the category, because outside of that, if it wasn't, then people would use this to build their own blogs, right? It was very developer bottom up, and it didn't really have an application inside large organizations because those headless services didn't really exist yet, right? Like, good luck finding an enterprise-ready commerce solution that was headless because it didn't exist yet, right? It came.
Yeah, I want to quickly ask, how did you jumpstart that chicken and egg dilemma? Because you need headless services for this kind of architecture
Absolutely.
to work.
Absolutely.
How did that come together?
Well, so first of all, we were sort of like out there talking about the examples of this have been, very self-architected, but with great extent. There was the Obama campaign, which was from a digital point of view, quite a milestone. So they had been built with a separate, like, decoupled front end, right? You can almost call it a modern static site, right? Where that meant that the load they could take at peak peak times traffic wise wouldn't lead to the site crashing, which it would in other circumstances, because you can't handle that much traffic alone. But here you could distribute the load. Now, it wasn't a service that anyone else could go and buy and use. It was very homemade, but it had used an early site generator called Jekyll, I think made in Ruby by Tom Preston-Werner, founder of GitHub, actually. And sort of like so we saw these examples that had great benefit and also like very sort of obvious value proposition for an enterprise as well, right? And we went and talked about these things. We also, our first clients that built meaningful things, they had to self-architect a lot of these things, right, in order for this to scale. And then we spent a ton of time like thinking about how do we engage with the community, right? So, in open source projects, we made deploy to Netlify buttons so you can click through those, and then your README text would be a website with a single click, because we had automated everything that was into the CDCI solution, right? We took all the site generators and made the what became the world's largest open source directory of site generators in the world. And every time someone would submit something to that, we would get that contact info, and we could reach out to them and say, hey, like, this is awesome. Love what you're doing. You want to chat around like how this could be, and even like, how you're part of a bigger thing, right? And so we created like advocates and fellow sort of enthusiasts about that, because that was the idea, right? Get into the tool builds of as many developers as possible, and then create awareness of this entirely new way to build. Because again, it's not just getting people to use Netlify. It has for us to succeed, we had to, and for our vision of a better web to succeed, the ecosystem had to be built out. And so, of course, you then go to the conferences and you do meetups and do everything you can, right? And then you do integration with anyone coming out. So even if it's an early CMS that's decoupled, Contentful already existed, because they had seen the notion of saying, hey, if you have a mobile app and you have a .com, it would be great to have not the front end dictated, because then you can do whatever you want and then you can just pull from the same place, right? So we started, meeting with the founder there every 2 weeks, so talking about how do we get the mission out there, right? So really heavily engaging with an early community was a big part of it. And then thankfully, the ecosystem really came. And I think it came because it was a win-win-win, right? Hey, this is objectively speaking a better way to build, right?
And tell me more about that community, because like there's one of the I won't call it a criticism, but like people like Greg Dunlap and others in our community have observed in Low Etheridge at HighGraph, and others have pointed out like there's this kind of everything you said, it makes sense that developer relations and DevRel outreach is probably the thing that makes the most sense. But a lot of content people feel a little not excluded, but like kind of like, hey, can you come talk to us? But I know you're doing like heavy, deep back end work. So but was it ever part of your plan to go like further out from the core and out talking to like designers and content people? Yeah, tell me a little bit about those. Yeah,
1,000%, right? So, first of all, I think we called it the biggest microservice out there, needful, right? And that was just like, what dynamic quote unquote function is the most needed by the most users out there? And it's a content management system, a way to create and update content for people that don't with code, essentially, right? Like very, very simply speaking. And we also knew that nothing became a standard without open source. And so there was Contentful, but there was no open source CMS out there. And so we actually built our own called Netlify CMS. And it was only because the others were API driven, and we wanted a Git based one, because that was the new workflow. Everything went through Git, like the whole notion of GitOps really started there. And so we did this. And then thankfully, within a year or two, we started seeing other commercial players come up with both Git based stuff, open source stuff, close stuff. Like it became a saturated landscape, and we started seeing all these content management solutions. And for me, it's sort of like, well, if you're trying to build a CMS, right, and you're trying to give that catering experience, one thing if it's a site builder, if there's never a developer involved, but that I feel is a very separate part of the market. We're talking about the market that's the 70% that's built by professionals for themselves or other people, right? And I think those are the ones we're catering. And once you talk about that, but they also in their organization have content moderators and so on that needs to be done. Then I really believe that having something where you can create a great experience, but at the same time not restrict people to saying, well, it's never gonna work very well on this digital touch point, or it's not gonna translate to this at all, and so on, right? I think that's a huge advantage, right? So I saw a lot of early people that were working with content management and so on that said, hey, this could be the first time where we really get a content management solution at length that will cater both developers and content creators and content managers, because there was a huge divide then, right? Like the CMSs, and I came from 14 years in SIs before that, and I was chief digital officer. I was very aware of the divide, you know. I came from a place where I had front-end developers as well, by the way, that exclusively cut out Photoshop files and turned them into HTML. That was the job. That was what front-end development was, right?
I remember
and then
those
sent
days.
them off to implementation, right?
Yeah, totally remember that. That's right, and your agency background, because you spent 14 years, you had a lot of experience building digital experiences and having a feeling of like, oh, I bet there's better tooling and platforms we could be working on.
Oh, yeah.
Was that how relevant was that to the foundation and the whole the conceptual foundation of your work?
Yeah, I mean, like, when Matt, my co-founder, who was already doing a fully hosted CMS over here, actually doing it as a monolith, but feeling like he was building for obsolescence at every turn he took, and every time something new came out, and new trends in front end and so on, they weren't moving towards what he was doing, but it felt to him foundationally like it was moving away, and he came with these sort of basic notions of like, hey, what this decouplement would look like. What was interesting for me was that he was challenging what I thought was the premise of doing business online. Like the notion of optimizing by not having a server was as like relevant to me as trying to optimize for people that don't have screens. It's like, well, okay, well, you don't have a screen, that's probably going to be hot, right? You know, like it wasn't, in other words, something that I was spending a lot of time on, right? Like, but at the same time, the security concerns, they were becoming brutal, right? I don't remember the Drupal, right? Like it was sort of on their website, like on the main website, they were like, if you haven't patched your site within 7 hours, you should consider yourself hacked, and all your plugins will break, right? Because they don't necessarily. It was a messy time, and there was more and more of it. But you know, of course there is, right? Because all of these are building in the open constantly everywhere. And they're also a very large surface area. They have to cater for all these edge cases. It just becomes quite hard. And the complexity of what you need to do and what you need to integrate with is also exploding exponentially. So for so many reasons, that was hard, right? Scalability as well, right? More and more people had, you know, were visiting sites, and mobile was coming out, and we saw all that traffic as well, right? And so there was just, you know, it was really starting to creak, right? And like all the times people said, so what kind of hosting solution do we want for this? I don't know, we just build it. Like let's hope that people come, right? And so Western agencies double provision hosting cost on average by 700%, like 700%. That's because like most things could probably get away on putting on a dream host or whatever it's called, like in your local market, like something that's cheap and easy. But of course, like in a minute you get real traffic, you're done, right? Because you didn't pay for that. And so if you're done because you opted for like a campaign site, and all of a sudden it gets traction, like gets mentioned on the front page of New York Times, and you tell your client the reason it went down was because we chose a $9 a month hosting solution, probably not going to talk to that client again. And so like you over provisioned, and then still 3, 4, 5 times a year, it wasn't enough, and you had those things, right? And so this notion of saying, well, it's pre-built to a much larger extent, it's already globally distributed because it lives on an ADN/CDN. That was a huge value proposition to me. It's like, oh, I don't even have to think about it. It's just there, you know? And then you can say, well, what about the let's say a checkout experience or something else that needed to be dynamic later on? Yeah, sure, but at least they have a working site that they're on, you know, and it's not just blanking out. Like you can give them a pretty rich experience already. And so the more I dove into this, the more I saw it challenged my main issues around performance and scalability and security. And so that was why I became really bullish on this and say, hey, this is fantastic, right? And then there was the adventure of doing this with a friend, moving to Silicon Valley and trying this out, right? I was like, okay, I'm enticed. And at this point, I'd also done so many projects, but there's a limit to how deep you go when you're an outside agency and you move on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And I welcome the notion of saying, I want to double click on this and see how deep the rabbit hole goes, right? So that was my last reasoning.
And here, only not even 10 years later, here you are, already departing it, like kind of, I don't know if you're going like mission accomplished, but that's awesome. Hey, one thing I wanted to talk about, I think a lot of people, their appreciation of the benefits of these architectures probably comes out of that. Like I remember 10 or 15 years ago, it was super common to have that, oh crap, the site went down because of, some successful promotion. The other one that's really, I think, really relevant to a lot of people is like search engine optimization and the growing importance over the years of site performance is one of the metrics there. Are there are those kind of two major things, or are there other benefits of these kind of architectures that jump out?
Yeah, lots. By the way, just for what you were saying before, right? This notion of how it's proliferated, right? I mean, today I have stood up, but if you look at the notion, right? Like we started with 0.01% of sites built in this way. Now it's probably 97%, right? The best practices can keep evolving, but the notion that the way you're building the presentation layer is pretty separate from that backend. It doesn't have to be dictated by it outside of a site builder environment or target audience. We had like 97% or something. It's completely happened, right? And so even the notion of the Jamstack isn't used very much because it was such a quick term to outlive itself because it became default, right? And it's the same if you think of before, we didn't talk of dynamic websites. We did in the beginning, but then everything was made with that server-side hack of, hey, we're going to build for every visitor because then you can have someone leave a comment and someone then read it even if they're like visiting the site 2 seconds later, right? It was beautiful, right? And so it's really one of those things that truly has become, and I love this notion of coming out and solving those problems. And Netlify has also ourselves seen some growth here. We have about 5 million developers at this point, right? And businesses, and they run around 50 million site stores and apps. So we've also seen the scale there, and of course this has evolved into enterprises using this for the largest of the digital solutions. But yes, I think the notions that we talked about now was so far the advantages of decoupling. But if you go to the advantages of a composable architecture, so let's zoom out a little bit and look at larger solutions. So instead of just a website, let's talk about your digital experience platforms, the DXPs or the like. That means sort of larger suites that encompasses your .com. It might also have campaign sites, but it also has a lot of different backend modules, so content management and commerce and so on. And I think the notion there, and I saw that as an SI, it was so painful because you had these huge monoliths, right? And then you're saying, okay, well, this is dated, or for whatever reason, we can't use it anymore. It doesn't offer the right multilingual support for what we need to do, the markets we're in. Whatever your reason is, I want to move to the next thing. Now, you built that out. You port all the content and so on. You feature lock it, and 18 months later, you're live. And this is a multi-year process. And you have no idea if this was a good idea or if the millions and millions that you spent were well spent until you start switching it on, right? And so that's super painful. And I often thought, like, this is grotesque, right? We want to change this part, but because of that, we have to change everything else. And everyone will do everything they can to lock you in. So it's not easy. Yeah. And I think the beautiful part, and one of my favorite parts of decoupled and composable architecture, is the ability to gradually migrate, right? It also means that, hey, I have this, right? And actually, this part I really like, right? It's part of my old monolith, it works and so on, but these parts don't. Well, let's change those parts first. What it also means is that you get it like changing everything. There's no silver bullet. That will probably take as long as it did before, but you get value gradually and along the way. And that is a huge, huge differentiator, right? This notion of saying, yes, the architecture works. I can see it. Our conversion metrics are better, right? Our operational costs have lessened. Our time to market is much shorter. And I can see that right here. So let's do it for more of the solution. That's powerful. It's so hard to do with a traditional monolith. And then I think another thing, and this is what I've spent the last few years in Netlify often around, right? I think there's always these digital transformations. And I think that by now, finally, we have an enterprise, especially sort of audience that knows that, okay, maybe this digital transformation thing that I've been sold on now for 2, 3, 4 times, maybe that's just going to keep happening. Fair enough. But I think outside of that, and I often say this, that when I sat with a CTO, VP of engineering, whoever it might be, right? Like the key stakeholders back in the day in my SI's work. Essentially what I was doing, where even if, it could be finding out a social media monitoring tool for Sony of Northern Europe, or it could be sort of the digital strategy for a Walmart of Northern Europe overall. But it always came down to trying to figure out what is the right solution. That was it, right? Today, those conversations have fundamentally changed. Now, there is no right solution. Like the notion is that what they have to do is to be agile enough to move fast enough, right? To be able to take services, use them, and discontinue them, right? To constantly interchange your stack. And I think, well, we had 10 times more digital services than we did 10 years ago. And there was a lot 10 years ago, right? But secondly, this notion of being composable becomes extremely important when you look at things like AI. Now, AI is a newborn, right? It's an infant, generative AI. We can always discuss how intelligent it is, right? But it's very good at summarizing, synthesizing, and automating a bunch of tasks. And there's only more of it. Already now, there's this notion that most businesses will have to, at this point, have leaned in to AI in one way or another by vendors or themselves in order to not, stay at a competitive disadvantage, right? But how in the world are you going to pick a winner at something that's barely, started, right? The notion that, oh yeah, these are the ones and this is how it's going to be and we're just going to build that way. That's naive, right? And basically anyone I will talk to will know that, whether they're, practitioner or whether they're enterprise buyer or whatever, right? And so, in other words, you have to lean in, but there's no way to pick the right solution necessarily. So there's a perfect example of saying what I need to be able to do if I'm responsible for driving the digital infrastructure or digital solutions for my company, I have to be able to make a decision where I can take on something, integrate it into a stack, and then discontinue this or discontinue something else with as little friction as possible, right? So it needs to be able to also by mergers and acquisitions and all these things. How do we remove friction and stay agile as we use all these different services? That is the key, not finding the right solution. And so obviously that's also a very big focus of Netlify, providing you all the necessary automation. Because if you keep doing operations as usual and you have all these different building blocks and specialized engineers for all of them, your time to market is going to suffer so greatly. And there's so much manual work that taking this new component, these new intelligence software, whatever it might be, and implementing it into the rest of the stack is going to carry so much friction that is no longer viable, right? And so you don't, and if you don't, then you're left at a disadvantage. And so I think that's really the notion. And if you zoom out from fly up in your helicopter and zoom out as much as you can, and when it comes to this notion of the benefits of decoupling, that's probably the very largest and furthest reaching one.
Yeah, and I think
you have to go composable.
Yeah, like 5 years ago, that merger and acquisitions use case would have been probably the most compelling. And now it's like AI. Are you sure that your monolith vendor is doing the exact right thing that you need, or should you be trying stuff on your own?
Yeah. Are they sure?
Exactly. Yeah. No. Hey, Chris, I can't believe it. We're coming up on time. But before we wrap up, is there anything last? Anything we haven't got to that you want to make sure we cover, or anything you want to revisit from the conversation?
No, I mean, like this, there's so much to talk about. This was a bit a trip down to like, how do we get here and what Decoupled is and why is it important? There's also the notion of how is AI going to influence this, right? The different content creators, for example, like how do you stay relevant, right? I was traveling around Europe talking about content marketing in my SI days, right? And today, and I love the notion, right? Like this notion of saying, hey, you want to go and qualify your product rather than just carpet bomb advertisement. Love it. Do that, right? Carries credibility and a bunch of other things with it, right? And in our world of SaaS, it means like integration into third-party software and all these things, right? And articles on how best to use the product and adjacent things to your product and so on. Like the problem now is becoming it's already saturated. Like there's not a company that doesn't do a lot of this and have podcasts and all these things. But with AI and the notion of being able to auto-generate these things, right? Like what's a user going to do if you look at even something quite specific and there's 100,000 hits, right? And is it just going to be a Google that decides that, right? And I think that going back to creativity and providing real quality content, and probably less of it, right, is going to be one of these things that's gonna be part of how you win and how you get your voice out there, more so than just the execution itself of provide a bunch of content and do it quickly, right? Which I think we've seen more of in the last 10 years. So I think there's for content creators, things change. Of course, the authoring services like CMSs in itself is going to change very much, right? Because a lot of that is about the structured data, right? And the notion of that changes if AI does a lot of these implementations for you, right? So I think like you want to keep your eye on the ball of the actual value add, which is the content creation in itself, right? How do you do that best? And what are the right channels for that and so on, right? But the landscape is obviously changing tremendously, right? And our channels of storytelling changes, right? Where we might have a little bit of interaction in a social media. Now, social comments, you can do the whole transaction there. I'm sure that the aggregators like Google are going to go more in that direction already. You don't go to the weather channel anymore. You go to Google and it'll show you the weather right there. The same with plane tickets. That's probably going to happen with a lot of other things as well, right? So the buck is totally moving and very, very fast in that way, right? But I think if I was doing, and I was sitting and my focus was content creation, I would be more than ever thinking about what is the actual value add here and how do I double down on that part, the quality of the actual and relevance of the actual content.
I think that's going to resonate with my folks a lot, the importance of relevant quality content. Thank you so much, Chris. Oh, hey, one very last thing. If folks want to follow you or connect online, what's the best place to find you?
Absolutely. I mean, like there's I'm on the socials, but yeah, LinkedIn is a good one. Christian Bach, Christian Chris, I think it says Bach, because I used to go by Christian back in Europe, and then Chris sort of happened over here. But LinkedIn is a good place. Yeah.
Excellent. I'll put that in the show notes as well. Well, thank you so much, Chris. This was so awesome to get your perspective on this.
Thanks so much for having me. It was fun.
Thank you for listening. If you can think of a friend who might enjoy this episode, please share it with them. And please join us again for our next content strategy interview.